What you just saw was the highest ranked Torb OTP in the West, Cheeseburger, tilt one of the biggest high level streamers, Kraandop.
And then he kills my tracer. Oh.
But how does he do it? Torb still has one of the worst pick and win rates in high elo, yet somehow Cheeseburger is killing former pro players from spawn, dinking pro level tracer players constantly, causing streamers to crash out in the worst way possible. So how does he do all of this on arguably the worst DPS in the game? Let's find out. Of course, we'll be taking a look at the kraandop game first, using a cheeseburger to structure the video, also known as the J. Cole meal. The base bun is Torb's unusual overload usage. Cheeseburger uses overload pretty early in fights, which does seem unusual. He pops his overload quite some distance away from kraandop, swinging pretty aggressively with his Orisa to try and land some good shots. When I questioned Cheeseburger about this, he mentioned that the spam value is super strong and the 10-second cooldown is super short. And while I wouldn't say that last bit, it does certainly feel short when you're using it in the pre-fights. In fact, Cheeseburger gets his second overload perfectly in time for when Kran tries to push the bots. Again, this looks really counterintuitive. I don't think any Torb guide out there, including my own, advises early usage. The reason is that if you use it too late, you'll miss key opportunities. On Iconwald against pro players Dip on Zoro, who somehow made it to the Stockholm finals on Team Peps, you can see the potential issue with overloading early. Cheeseburger pops it while the enemy team try and get through the choke, but because his diva flies back, he can't really peek for poke. As a result, the enemy Ram's able to walk up basically for free, trying to slow down Cheeseburger. But the Ram gets low, and you can see how now, having overload to punish the Ram would have been very useful. So one of the keys to early overloading is making sure that you can actually push forward, like how we saw the Orisa pushing forward with the Torb earlier. Pushing back the enemy team like this gives Cheeseburger distance and time to get his overload back. Or you can just overload super early before a fight is about to begin, making sure that you actually move backwards to give yourself time and space to get it back again. But we're not done there with the micro. Usually with overload, try and treat it like a cycle. Generally, the first half is for aggressive purposes, and the second half is for repositioning or retreating backwards. Pay attention to how in the first 3 to 4 seconds, Cheeseburger is pushing forward with his Orisa, but he uses the last 2 or so seconds to back out. That extra second buff that Torb got a while ago goes a long way in helping both the aggressive and passive parts to overload too. The real meat of the video though lays within Cheeseburger's central playstyle, to be like an off-tank. Something he said to me in my chat too, which is mostly about drawing aggro and controlling space around the main team fights. We'll see that when it comes to controlling traitors very soon, but back to Esperanza, where Cheeseburger and his team actually get the cap, he chooses to hold the room opposite to his Orisa. The idea here is that if Kran pushes Cheeseburger super hard, Torb has the sustain to lift that push, which is exactly what we see. Cheeseburger is almost baiting Kran to come and chase him, and once he does, he pops the overload to lift the push. Kran ends up terror surging out in the open, but sadly gets no value because of the beats. Also notice once more that Cheeseburger just about gets his overload back when he gets pushed, implying that he just about got the timing right when using it early for spam. Again, this playstyle is super unorthodox. How many coaches or players would have just said to hold the high ground and spam? The issue is, had Cheeseburger done that, his Orisa is gonna get pushed super hard because nobody's there to draw the aggro. We have seen other characters like Reaper who can draw or juggle aggro with Zarya, or even Venture who can do a similar thing too. But Torb is the only ranged DPS that can do this. The meta characters you see that I put in A tier myself can't do this. But now, time to move on to the cheese, of course being Torb's turrets. Cheeseburger told me that something the general player base don't really know is that people overvalue or think too much about turret placements. Considering how Torb couldn't just toss his turret anywhere back in Overwatch 1, and how much more dynamic Overwatch 2 is, this does make sense. Of course, if you're an improver and watch Spylo, you'll know that turret is either used like an alarm to mark flankers, or it's placed on off angles for value. It's that off angle one which is super important, and sometimes it'll just get random kills because nobody is thinking about turret in the mid fights. The placement doesn't need to be perfect, and often it'll get broken in the mid fights, but as long as it's on a different angle and distracts the enemy team, that's pretty much the max value that turret can get. In this fight, for example, Cheeseburger tosses the turret just over the Orisa shield, and while it gets broken pretty much immediately by the enemy Kiriko, the time she spends looking at the turrets means that she's not healing Orisa, who does go down to critical HP. And lastly, similar to other deployables like Ilari's Pylon, don't forget to move your turrets if it's doing nothing in the mid-fights. But of course, you might have realized that most of the examples I used were Torb's turret being stuck to a wall, giving me the perfect segue to talk about the perks. I did make a Torb video somewhat recently talking about the perks, but as you've seen in this video, Cheeseburger is not your average Torb player. For his minor perk, he pretty much almost always goes with the Overload one that gives him full ammo back, instead of the hammer perk that gives you a 20% speed boost. Overload already gives you 6 ammo back without the perk, so when I reviewed Cheeseburger's Torb on stream, I was confused, but he told me that again, it's once more for spam value. Judging by how often he uses Overload, it actually makes sense. But then, when should you pick the hammer perk? Well, I think Cheeseburger accidentally takes it on New Queen Street, but it's more of a playstyle thing. On more open maps like New Queen Street, where flanking and rotating becomes a bit harder, having extra speed does help. But as we've seen with how much he treats Torb like an off-tank, there's mostly no need. As for his major, he always picks the sticky turrets. Unlike the hammer perk, I don't think there's a case where having a level 3 turret is gonna be more valuable. One thing Cheeseburger loves doing though is marking out tracers, and somehow he just hits dink after dink after dink. And it honestly looked ridiculous at how many times he managed to dink tracers, but I think I know the secret, which is just good crosshair placements. Now yes, some of the time, the tracer would just be a little dumb and blink straight into Cheeseburger. But most of the time, on approach, Cheeseburger's crosshair is placed basically at the corner. In this example, the tracer swings pretty wide to the right, but Cheeseburger has his crosshair placed firmly at the corner, expecting the tracer to go back into cover, meaning she almost walks into the headshots. Once more coming back from spawn, his crosshair is as close to the left corner as possible before firing a single shot, which yes, while he doesn't know the tracer is actually there, had his crosshair been any wider and he's just not hitting the shots. On Iconwald against Dip, notice how he initially puts his crosshair precisely next to the left doorway, but realizing Dip isn't there, he changes back to the other doorway, hitting Dip while readjusting his crosshair. Now that's not to say that Cheeseburger hasn't got nice mechanics. In fact, he gets a really nice flick here onto the tracer, forcing recall. Then, he overflicks his next shot, but immediately corrects for it, hitting yet another dink and letting his turret do the finishing blow. But when it comes to poking out Tracer, it's something I've just noticed rewatching his Tracer duels. Still, this doesn't answer when should you mark a Tracer and why. Back on Suravasa, where for some reason Kevster's on Kiriko, maybe he really did let himself go after that Map 5 Gen G loss. And actually, if you guys want a Is Kevster Washed video, let me know too. Regardless, when Cheeseburger has control of the points, he can just play to stalemates, basically meaning to hold your own angle and mark out anyone that comes to you. Cheeseburger can just take a 1-on-1 on the right side, while his team take a 4v4 on the left side. The reason for stalemating is that it minimizes the risk while you just farm up the point cap and win. But what if you're not holding space and instead you're attacking? Well, Cheeseburger still likes marking out Tracer. The primary reason this time is to do with the squishiness of his backline, being Wuyang Kiriko. If Wuyang is able to live, especially with the HP nerf, he's probably gonna outvalue a Lucio in the long run. And actually, you can see Cheeseburger force out Tracer's recall precisely because he spent time marking them out. The issue here, sadly, is that he's like the Japanese soldier who kept fighting for 29 years. To put it another way, he spends way too long marking the Tracer, which allows the enemy Kiriko to slip through and double tap his backline. Had he just pushed up after the recall got forced, this probably doesn't happen. But this all leads me to the final top bun, which I'll soon reveal, but first a quick coaching plug. Click the top link down below if you want personalized help climbing. Anyways, the last layer are triggers, coom and bans. By triggers, I just mean when it's fine to walk up and be more aggressive. Forcing out Tracer recall is a trigger like we just saw. But also, when playing into dive, if the enemy ball uses all his cooldowns during his dive, that is the perfect time to push forward because you're no longer in danger. You can see the Torb cast hard push the ball here after shields and pile driver have been used. As for your ultimates, it's fairly self-explanatory. Cheeseburger mainly used it to clear power positions from the enemy team. For example, seeing the Brig cast control this high ground, Cheeseburger pops the Molten Core to zone it off, which forces the Brig to split and go cart, while the cast takes this super long and awkward rotation underneath the high grounds. But don't just spam out your coom randomly though. Just like Crosshair placement, try and place it specifically on corners or retreat paths, which you can see Cheeseburger try and do to force the enemy team as far back as possible. As for bans, Cheeseburger just prioritizes the Pharah ban and then bans around his teammates, which does make sense considering it's hard to hit a Pharah compared to any hitscan. Anyways, that's it for the video. If you enjoyed, be sure to subscribe and click the video on screen too. Until next time.